What if you knew exactly which automation platform to use? Make or n8n, so you don't waste tons of time learning the wrong platform. I've been using AI automation to generate well over $100,000 per month consistently. So today I'm going to condense down what I've learned teaching hundreds of beginning automators and hundreds of business owners so that you can pick the right automation platform the first time. But I'm not going to just explain the differences. I'll go further and explain why these different features matter to you specifically or not, whether you're a beginner or intermediate automator or business owner looking for the right solution. By the end of this video, you'll know the important differences between Make and n8n and which platform is best for you. First, I'll cover the basics, pricing, the user interface, how the platforms are similar and different, and we'll cover their support for new AI tools, plus an analysis of why all of this matters to you and your business. So here's the agenda. First, we'll go over pricing and features, the user interface and experience, technical differences and similarities, AI adoption and the various features they have, why it matters to you, and make sure to stick around to the end of the video to learn the number one thing to know about picking your automation platform. If you're excited about the future of AI automation, but don't want to waste your valuable time on the wrong platform, this video is for you. I'm about to condense down thousands of hours of experience into just a few minutes. All right, so let's get going. Let's talk about the pricing and features. So what you're going to find in both Make and n8n is they both have this tiered pricing where we have pricing that goes up on this horizontal side where we are either the starter, the pro, or the enterprise plan. And you can see here in Make, we have the same thing. We have the free, we have the core, we have the pro, teams, and enterprise. And what you can see is these additional tiers give you access to additional features in the various platforms. And you can see n8n is the same. And as well, both platforms allow you to select how many operations you want to buy per month for any given tier. So here I'm in the core plan, we can buy 10,000 operations, 20,000 operations, 40,000 operations. And then over here on n8n, you can see here we have 2.5 workflow executions. So this is where we run up against one of the real differences between n8n and Make and how they price. At first glance, you might say, well, I'm paying $20 a month for 2,500 workflow executions, but on Make for $9, I'm getting 10,000 operations. So Make clearly seems a lot cheaper on the surface. However, when you look under the hood, the way that Make and n8n charge for these operations is different. So if we look at a Make automation here, every single one of these nodes here, when the automation runs, is going to cost us one operation. So you can see in this automation, we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 operations to fully execute this automation. So n8n works a bit differently. They don't charge per operation, they charge per workflow execution. So if we have a big complicated automation like this, and it starts to run and it's going through all of these different nodes one by one, it's only going to charge us one whole operation for running this entire automation. So it's charging you for the execution of the entire workflow. They aren't trying to get you to pay for each different node that you add to your automation. But still, there's a few things to consider in that when you are on the starter plan, you are only allowed to have 5 active workflows. So if I come back to this automation and I turn it on, I'm actually only able to have 5 different workflows active at any different time. Whereas in Make.com, as long as you have a paid plan, you can have an unlimited number of active scenarios. So if we were to take a look at this automation here, I could have hundreds of these various automations all running at the same time. There's no limit. But in n8n, I'm only allowed to have 5 active workspaces similar to this running at any given time. Now it does start to get a bit more technical, but the workflows in Make are also a bit more advanced in that you can have several different automations running in the same workflow. So here we have a webhook that is listening for a new video coming out of Zoom, and it's a complete automation that is sitting here in the workflow. And then we have an entirely different automation here that is listening for messages coming in from Slack. So you can have one workflow that has numerous different scenarios running inside of it. So really, even with one workflow, you could have several different automations within that workflow. So with these containers that you can use in n8n, you can separate logically all of your different automations and actually store them in one workflow. And that's nice because in Make, sometimes you have a lot of different scenarios and you're always searching through them and trying to find them. Whereas in n8n, you can organize them just like this. So this is a way of getting around the limited number of workflows. Of course, you can always upgrade as well. One other important difference is that n8n will limit the number of concurrent executions you have at any one time. So if you have a bunch of these different automations and workflows, it's going to limit you to a maximum of 5 concurrent automations running at the same time. So you can imagine if you have a lot of different automations and triggers all running at the same time, you could easily run into a situation where you're running more than 5 automations at a time, which is going to bottleneck it. They're going to go into a queue. And then once you're running fewer automations, then the next one will kick in automatically. And then if you upgrade, you can get up to 20 concurrent executions. Make.com is different. If you have 100 different automations just like this, they can all be turned on and running at the same time, and there are no limits. Now, there are some smaller differences between n8n and Make.com. If you scroll down on their pricing page, you can get a very detailed feature list based on the tier you're on. So it's important to go through all these different features, but the one I do want to call out, which is very different from n8n, is the concept of data limits. So Make.com is very strict in terms of how much data they will allow you to transfer through their system. When you're actually working with a specific file, you are limited to 5 or 100 or 250 or 500 megabytes based off of the tier you're on. You can only work with a file of that maximum size. And if we look at these numbers here, 5, 100, 250, and 500 are relatively low, especially if you're talking about working with any sort of video or large data file. They also monitor how much data you are actually pushing through their system. If you come to one of their automations, they are actually keeping track of how much data is going through the network, even when you're just passing around text. So all of this text that you're pushing around in their system, they're keeping track of that. And if you reach that limit, you are going to run out of data transfer. Now, if you're just moving around a lot of text like this, you're not going to run into any sort of issue. But again, if you are moving around large files, then this limit is going to be an issue that you really need to consider in your automation development and picking which platform you want to use for your automations. In n8n, they are not charging or keeping track of your data transfer. So if you are working with large files or working with a lot of data, then n8n is going to be a better solution. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the Community Edition, which is a free version of n8n that you can actually download and use. It's exactly like their hosted version, except you have to host it on your own server. So you'd have to go to a platform like DigitalOcean where you can launch your own server. Now, the advantage of this is that you can actually run a server for a very small amount of money per month. You might need a slightly larger server than just $4 a month, but what you can see here is that for a very small amount, you can launch your own server and you can simply install n8n on that server and you can use it as if you were using the cloud version. So when you pay n8n directly, what you're essentially paying for is the hosting. You can see here that it's hosted by n8n. So they basically set this up. It's really easy to use. You don't have to set up your own server. There are obviously certain limitations to the paid plans, whether it's starter, pro, or enterprise, but there is overhead in setting up your own servers. So this might seem like a great option for a lot of people. Hey, we can launch our own n8n server. There's not going to be any limits. And that's a great thing to mention here is that if you download and install your own version of n8n, none of these limits are going to apply to you. You'll be able to have as many workflows running at the same time. You'll have no limits in terms of workflow executions. You won't have any concurrent executions. You can put it on a low-cost server that would be cheaper than using the cloud services with n8n. But now it's important to remember that launching your own server comes with its own set of troubles. So when you start to launch your own servers on a place like DigitalOcean, you're starting to get into a more technical situation where you need to be able to fix certain issues that happen from time to time with servers. So while it might be cheaper month to month to launch your own n8n instance on a DigitalOcean server, if you don't know how to actually maintain this server, you could be in a situation where your server breaks down and you're just out of luck, or you have to hire expensive help to actually help you debug it or keep it running. So we'll talk more about how this fits into your specific plan, but self-hosting might be cheaper than n8n, but you might actually spend more if you have to hire expensive help to get you to run it, or you don't know how to manage it on your own. All right, so now let's go ahead and talk a bit more about the actual user interface and the user experience. So when you log in to Make, on the left-hand side here, you're going to have your main controls. You can manage your organization, your team, and your scenarios, templates, connections, webhooks, keys, devices. And n8n is going to feel very much the same. Now, again, they call them workflows instead of scenarios, but in general, the navigation is going to feel very similar, except it's workflows instead of scenarios. You got the templates, the admin panel. Here we have credentials, which is the same thing as connections in make.com. This is where you can see all the different connections that you have stored up for different APIs like Airtable or OpenAI or Google Drive, and the credentials here in n8n are the same. So in general, despite some differences in the names like workflows instead of scenarios and credentials instead of connections, the overall interface between n8n and Make is very similar. So now let's jump into an actual scenario or a workflow. Here I've got a workflow that is almost identical. Here we're in Make. You can see we have these nicely colored modules here that are connected with these lines. You can move them around. When your automation starts to get messy, there's this auto align feature that's really cool. It's not as impressive when there's only 2 modules, but you can see when you have a automation that is more complex, and let's say you're building it out and it just looks a little bit messy. Naturally, when you build something, it's not quite as perfect, but you can always come down here to this magic align and just pop it back into place. So even when you have pretty complex automations, you can always get them to look relatively clean. And that definitely does make it easier to work with. Now, when you start to work with automations in n8n, it's definitely going to have a more technical feel to it and a less polished look in terms of just having everything nicely organized and clean, like these little colored modules. Every module that you work with is going to have a slightly different color. So you got your HTTP module, this is blue. Then you've got your webhook, this is red. So these colors, even in a subtle way, make it much easier to just visually see things at a glance. In n8n, things start to blend together a bit more. But of course, if you really focus in on each individual module, you can see exactly what it is. But it's just harder to do at a glance, and you really have to look a little bit more closely. Everything is gray except for the logo. So it's definitely not something that you can't get over. And I find that once you start to work in either one of these, they both start to feel normal. So it's only really when you go from one to the other the first time where you start to say, wow, this looks a lot different. I like the other way. But once you work in either one of these, honestly, you'll get used to either one. All right, so now let's go into a quick demo here and actually look under the hood in these modules and talk a bit about how the experience is going to differ when you are using Make or n8n. So here we have a simple automation in Make. It's searching records in an Airtable database. Here we have 2 records in this Airtable database. It happens to be 2 different contacts with their full name and first name, last name, and email. Now what this automation does is it searches through the database and it takes the full name and it splits up the first and last name and adds them to the row. So if I were to remove all of this data here, and then we were to come back to Airtable and run this automation, this module here is searching for all of the records. And here you can now see we have first name and last name. It just added those back. And then this module here is simply updating each Airtable row with just the first name or the last name. And this example here is going to give us an inside look at how Make and n8n are quite a bit different. So first and foremost, let's open up this Airtable module. This is a simple Airtable search. At the top here, we have a connection and we have to select a specific base. That's like which base in Airtable are we actually using? And then we also have to select the table. And in this case, we're using the contact list table. So our base name is called contact list and the table is as well. We can sort the results coming out. We can limit it to a specific view. We can select which fields we want to see. We can see the formula here. And we can also see that there's a limit of 10 records. So when this runs, it's only going to bring back 10 records. Now, if we look at the equivalent version in n8n and we look here, we have, again, 2 modules. One is a search and one is an update. If we look at the search, now aside from it being graphically different with the inputs over here and the outputs over here like that, everything is actually relatively the same. We have the credentials, that's just like this here, the connection at the top. It's asking us which kind of resource that we want to work with. In this case, it's a record. There's a little more flexibility in this module in n8n where it can actually work with the base and get information from the base itself. So if you wanted metadata about the base, you could do that. Again, you pick the operation, which is a search. You pick the base and the table, right? So you can see base and table. So it's relatively the same. It's got a filter here with a return all. If we come back here, we've got a formula here as well. So you can see things match up almost one for one, except they might be a little bit different at times. And so you just kind of have to be aware and look out for these things so that you can spot them. Over here, we have a toggle switch, which is returning everything. If we turn this off, it's going to allow us to select the limit here. In this case, it's defaulting to 100. If I come back to Airtable, the default is limiting to 10. Same thing is going on here. It's just a slightly different interface and how they expose it and use it. And then in make.com down here, we have the show advanced settings, and they expose a few more different settings that you can use down here. And n8n is going to work in a similar way, except that they access that type of thing in the options. So here we have a bunch of different options that we can add to the automation. So here you notice that there's nothing about a view like we saw here. We had that view option, whereas in n8n, that is an option down here. You add the view and you can actually do the exact same thing that you could do in make.com. If we look here, should have the same grid view, just like that. And then of course the sort is down here, whereas in Airtable, it was right here. So when it comes to a direct comparison to the modules that are in Airtable or n8n, there's going to be differences, no doubt, across the board. But in general, what you're going to find is similarities just like that, where they basically do the same thing. There might be a little bit more or less in either one of them, and they might be slightly configured differently or a different order, but they essentially do the same thing. Now, where things start to differ is when you actually start to run these automations and start to use them. So I'm going to refresh this page just so we can refresh and lose the fact that we had some existing that had already been run. I'm going to come back to make here. I'm not going to save the changes here. I already had those. I'll go ahead and refresh this. So we're starting fresh again. So now one of the main differences between make and n8n is simply just how you can step through these automations one by one. And that's important because when you build these automations, especially these larger ones, typically the way you do it is you build the first one, you run it, you figure out how it's working, then you build the next one, you figure out how it's running, you do the next one, you figure out how it's running, you do the next one. You just kind of step through it that way, validating each one is working as you go. And that's the same way you do it in make as well, except that in make, when you test your automation, you have to test the entire thing. So I have to come down here and run it. This automation is small, so it's going to run quite quickly. But you can see here, I had to run both of these modules. If I were to come to this node here and simply try to run this module only, it's going to actually ask me for information. Now, normally this information is passed in from this module. And in fact, we can open this up and we can see here that we have a function here, and we're passing in the full name from one, and one here happens to be the search. So we're taking values from this module and we're inserting those into this module. But when we run this once, it's not able to look here and look at this data and to help us out and just make this easy. We actually have to fill this in manually. So I would have to put in an ID here, which is possible. And I do use this from time to time. It's just a pain. So I would have to come here. I'd have to grab this record ID, and then I'd have to put a name here and click OK. And now this one module will run using the data that I added. Now in n8n, it's much easier. I can run a single module here. It's going to run. It's going to run successfully. And I can go in here and see the output from that particular module. And now I can directly use that here when I run this. It's going to know that I already run this previously, and it's just going to use that information that was already there, which is what I would expect to happen normally. Now, when there's only two modules, it doesn't feel like that big of a deal, right? Because it just doesn't take that long. But when you have a more complicated automation like this, where you have several different modules that are before an existing one, if you have to rerun it every time, or if you have something even more complex like this, if you have to step through every module just to test a module down here, or if we look at this example here in make.com, if we had to run this entire automation every single time just to test this module, there's a lot of wasted operations that you're spending every single time just to test this module. Whereas n8n is going to allow you to test and save the results from each of these entries so that when you want to test this one, you can just test it and it's going to remember all these values and use them as needed. All All right, well, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump back to make here, and I'm going to delete these two modules just so I can show you the process of working with make versus n8n as we build out these sample scenarios so that you can see how it works. So again, this first module here was a simple Airtable search. So I'm going to add the trigger. In this case, the trigger is going to be a search records. So this trigger here is going to run at some specific interval. This is very similar to how n8n works as well. You have instant and interval triggers. Again, you have to select the connection. You have to select the base, table. In this case, we're going to leave the sort and the view alone. We're going to select all for the fields. We're going to leave the formula and the limit alone. We'll go ahead and save it. And now we can run this module only. And you're going to see that it's going to pull up two different rows from our contact database, as you see right here. So now again, I'm going to remove the first and last name because we're creating an automation to detect those from the full name. So I'm going to come back up to make, and we're going to go ahead and loop through these two rows, and we're going to look at the full name. We're going to split it up and put it back in the last name and first name. This is already here because when we ran this, those values were here, but I'll go ahead and run it again. We're going to see that those values are no longer here. So now I'm going to add another module, update record. Again, this is going to look very similar to n8n and the way it works over there. Again, the connection, it's going to pre-fill that from basically the one we used here. I'll go ahead and add the base and the table. And now it's asking us for the record ID. I'll show you the equivalent in n8n in just a moment, but we're just going to take this ID and drag it right here. That is taking the ID from this module. So it's basically saying, hey, we're looping through these different rows. Here's the ID of the row. And so if we're going to update a row, we need the original ID from this module. And we already have the full name. So now we need to figure out the first and the last name. So now this is where we're going to see one of the biggest differences between make and n8n. Now, make is going to make this a very friendly process relatively. So it does take some practice to use these different functions. But in this pop-up here, they have all of these different variables and functions and operators and keywords that you can use in these cells here to calculate information. You can do math. You can do string functions, you can uppercase everything, you can lowercase everything, you can do searches, you can trim spaces off the beginning and end of a string, you can uppercase strings, you can split strings, you can do things with dates, you can do things with arrays. These are all built-in functions for arrays. So to extract the first name from the full name, well, what we would need to do is first we would need to split the full name by a space, right? Because if we look at a full name, we're going to split it by a space. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to go to the string functions and I'm going to use split. So you can see here, it created the function for us. We can actually drop in the placeholder. If I come back here to the star, we can actually drop in the placeholder full name into that little section. And then here, I can add in a space. So what we see here is that we're splitting the full name by a space. So it's going to return two different strings, the first name and the last name, as an array. And so then what we need to do is we need to add another function, which is first, which is going to take the first element of an array. So you can see here is we're splitting the name into two pieces, and then we're saying take the first piece. And so you can imagine what we're going to do here. In fact, I'll just copy and paste it. But here I'm going to do last instead of first, of course. So here we're grabbing the first value of a split name by a space. So you split Stephen Pope in half with a space, you're going to get Stephen, and then Pope, that's going to get the Stephen, and this is going to get the Pope. So we can go ahead and save that. I'll save the automation as well. And then let's go ahead and run that, jump back to Airtable. And we're going to see here, we have those values. So that's pretty cool, right? You have access to all of these different functions here. And there's all sorts of stuff. All of the common things that you probably would need are here. Now let's jump over to n8n. I'll go ahead and delete these modules and we'll start from scratch. I'll add a node. We'll go to Airtable. In this case, we're going to do a search, pick your credentials. Again, resource, we're working with records. I'm going to do a search, contact list. Again, a lot of these things are going to feel very similar, but in just a moment, you'll see how they're different. So filter, we're going to leave that blank, return all, that's fine. Options, we can leave that. Let's go ahead and test it. So now we have the output here. So what you're going to find is when you're working with a module in n8n, you're going to have the inputs. You're going to have the inputs of the module before, and then you're going to have the outputs, which are the values coming out going into the next module. I'm showing you this in make, but you got the inputs and the outputs. So now we come to the next module here. And you might also notice this here. This is just a simple placeholder for the trigger. Technically, this module isn't a typical trigger for n8n. You can't run it as a trigger, so it actually creates this here for you so that you can test that workflow. Then we'll go ahead and add in the Airtable update. In this case, we're going to update a record. And so now what you're going to see is over here on the left is we're seeing all of the inputs from previous modules. So in make.com, the way that works is when you're in a module and you click into a field, you see all of the inputs from previous modules here in this box. Whereas in n8n, it's putting the inputs before essentially the process here, and then it's got all of the outputs coming here. So let's go ahead and pick the base. Got to change the connection, contact list, table, contact list. Here we have a special option for mapping column mode. Mapping each column manually just means that we're going to map all the values manually down below. Columns to match on. So it's asking us which columns we want to match in terms of updating a record. In this case, we're going to match on the ID. This is a unique ID. So we're going to use that. And then we would just drop that ID here. So this is going to feel very similar to make. So these placeholders look quite a bit different from make.com. You can see their placeholders are just quite a bit easier to read. They're not as, I guess I'll use the word scary. When we look at these n8n placeholders, they're starting to look a lot like code, like source code or code that we run on computers. And that's because that's what it actually is. So this is where you really start to see some of the major differences between make and n8n. In n8n here, in these expressions, in between these curly braces, and this isn't a video where I explain how to code, you can actually use code to manipulate the output that goes into any of these fields. So in make, we were using these functions, again, all of these different functions that you can find here, which is really quite awesome. And it's nice that you can just browse it and use it. And if we hover over it, it's going to give us some help. In n8n, in order to accomplish the same thing that we did here, we actually have to write a bit of code. So here, in this case, we're just pulling in the ID, so we don't need to do anything there. But here, when we get to the first name, if I drag in the full name right here, in a similar way that we did in make, now I don't have access to this array of built-in functions in n8n. Instead, what I have is the ability to write code. So this is going to be JavaScript code that I add here, where I just type split, and I'm going to split it by a space. And then after I split it, I'm going to access the first element of that array. So that's what this JavaScript does. It takes the full name, it splits it by a space, and then it takes the first element of the array that is created from the split, which is equivalent to what we have here. It's just in JavaScript instead of these friendly function calls. And then in order to figure out the last name, I could just simply cut and paste this. I could drop it into last name. I do need to hit expression here, which evaluates the text here instead of just considering it text. So if I were to put fixed here, then if I were to run this automation, it would literally add this text to the last name, which is not what we want. We don't really want this in a last name here, right? Like that's not what, we're not trying to do that. If you used fixed, that's what that does. It doesn't interpret it. If we use expression, then anything inside of these curly braces will run inside the code, and whatever the code returns, that's what will go into the last name. So the only thing we need to change here in the last name is just updating this to 1 so that it's looking at the second element of the array, the last element instead of the first. Here we're looking at the last, here we're looking at the first, and that is equivalent to what we had here. So let's come back to the contact list, remove this here, and then we can go ahead and test this step. Now again, remember, this was easy to do because we had already run the previous step. So n8n remembers that we had already run this. So again, remember, because we have that step debugging, we can actually run this one automation without rerunning everything else before it. And again, that becomes really important when we have the much more complex automations and we don't want to run the entire thing just to run something that's further down the line. So we just ran this. So if we jump back to our contact list, you're going to see here that we have essentially the same results from n8n as we did from make, except now we're using the JavaScript placeholders here. So now this is one of those first examples of where you can start to evaluate which platform you might want to use. Either way, there's going to be some learning curve, right? So if you're using make, you have to explore these different functions and use them and look at the help and kind of see how they work. Whereas in n8n, you're going to have to figure out the code. Now, I might argue that figuring out the code for some simple things might actually be easier. If we were to go to ChatGPT, how could we split a variable in a node and return the first word? Let's assume we had a full name, Stephen Pope, in n8n. What would the code be to split the name and return the first name? So let's just see how that goes. It literally returned the exact same thing that we just did. So that's pretty reassuring, right? So like if you're doing simple stuff and you're able to simply describe what you need to do, then ChatGPT is good enough to tell you exactly what you need to put in this particular value. Now, for some people, that's just overwhelming and they can never see themselves ever doing this. When they see code, they get turned off and they'd rather not. So if you don't want to get into anything like this, then n8n is just not going to be a great platform. But as you can see, with just a little bit of learnings and tryings and using ChatGPT, it's really not that hard to overcome. And the best thing about this is that code is very flexible. So pretty much anything that you can think of that you want to do, you can do. In Make, you are going to be limited by the functions that they have. So if it's not on this list, if it's not on this list here or this list here, then you're out of luck. You're going to have to figure out this problem in a different way. And as we continue to explore, we're going to continue to find more and more examples where n8n is just more technical. It allows you to do more, but in some cases, it's just a little bit more difficult. Now, one of the most important things to remember is that whether it is Make or it is n8n, both of these platforms are essentially doing the same thing. They are reaching out to various services like Gmail or Google Drive, HubSpot, or whatever they are. They're going out to these different platforms. They're simply making an API call to one of these platforms. They're sending it some input data, and then coming out of that automation is some sort of output data. And both of these platforms simply string together modules and allow you to go from inputs to outputs to inputs to outputs to accomplish a bigger task together. Now, under the hood here, how these things actually work on a computer or a server is quite complex. Now, what I would say on the most general level is that Make is trying to make this process as powerful as it can be, while still trying to make it as simple as can be. It would be quite easy for an employee or a non-technical person who had some determination to figure this out and to learn how to build automations quite easily. Now, sometimes in order to make things simple, you have to hide things, do these things on behalf of the user so they don't have to think about it. We sacrifice some ability to keep things simple. Now, of course, we can always pretty much accomplish the same task in Make. But when it starts to get complicated and when we want to use some really advanced features or some more subtle features, they might not be available in Make because they are trying to keep it simple. Whereas n8n, I think they're trying to make it as simple as possible, but they are not going to sacrifice functionality. They're not going to make it so you can't do as much purely to make it simple. So inherently, n8n is going to feel more technical. It's going to feel harder in some cases, so that it can do more easily. So Make is going to be powerful, but also simple, whereas n8n is going to give you full control. It's going to make you feel more like a developer, more like an advanced automator, but it's going to add complexity, or it's going to require additional knowledge to get it to work that you might not need on Make. When you are creating more complex things, that actually makes n8n easier to use, because to do some of the more complex things in Make, you end up having to go outside the box and do things that really just it wasn't meant to do. And so let's look at one simple example. I'm going to delete this trigger here, and I'm going to add a webhook. We have a webhook here. hook it up right here. So now let's go into this webhook. There's quite a few different controls here. We have a test URL and a production URL. We have the HTTP method. We have a path. We have authentication. We can control how the webhook responds. We have some additional options. Now let's head over to Make. Let's go ahead and add a webhook. We're going to create that URL here. We'll save it and we'll connect it up here. So now let's take a look at the options here. So as you can see, there really aren't any options. We can expand this and it gives us some additional capabilities here, but we're missing a lot of options that are possibilities when it relates to a webhook. Make.com is just not allowing us to access that information, which for maybe a large percentage of the population is actually a good thing because they just don't need to think or worry about those things. A lot of the things that we see here are not things that you would necessarily have to have. But if you did need those, it's important that you have them. So here, just to give you an example, in this webhook here, they give you a test and a production URL. So if you see as I click back and forth here, this webhook is changing, whether it's a test or a production. So that means to access this automation, it's going to use the test webhook when the automation is off. And when I turn it on to active, it's going to use the production URL. So when you're building out more advanced automations, that's a really cool feature because you can have a different test and a different production URL so that you can test your automations when you need to test them, but then you can also have them running in production and not mess it up. Imagine if you only had one URL, then whether you were testing or in production, you wouldn't be able to differentiate them and your tests would end up going into your production automations and it just creates stuff that you now have to clean up. In Make.com, you don't have that luxury. You just have one URL. Now, again, for most people, that's really just not a big issue. And so they don't even think about it. They never even consider it and they never even run into an issue because of it. But if you did need that test and production URL, you'd be out of luck. Now, on the flip side, it's great to have this functionality, but now it's something that you actually have to deal with. When you're testing this, you have to use this URL. And then once you activate it, you've got to switch that. So anywhere that this automation is being called, you're going to have to switch that and manage that. And it's not really a big issue, but it is something you have to do. Unless you need that, that might actually be kind of a pain, or you might not even understand. And in that case, using n8n is just going to feel too complex and you're going to wonder, why do I even have to deal with this? When I was using Make, I just had a URL. I didn't have to think about it. It always worked and I was good to go. I think that's the thing that you're going to find is that some of these platforms is just like, yeah, there's added features and added complexity if I need it, but if I don't, I actually don't want it, right? I would rather just make it easy and not have to think about it. But even beyond that, we have more control. We can change the path here. So if I add, the path, I can actually change it. You see how the path changed here. I'm not able to change the path here. I'd have to run a whole new one. And it comes up with the path on its own. I don't have any control over that. I can actually add authentication here so that nobody can call my webhook unless they have authentication. Make.com does not have any authentication, although I did talk with their VP and he says that will be added. And then here as well is that you can control when the webhook responds. So if somebody's calling a webhook, you might actually have a response. You might want to respond to the webhook with some sort of success or failure or whatever. In n8n, you can control, do we want to respond immediately or do we want to use a response webhook or do we want to respond when the last node finishes? We just have more control over when this responds explicitly, whereas in Make.com, even though there is a response webhook that will respond for you, you don't have explicit control over the configuration of these webhooks like you do in n8n. And if you start to build out really complex automations with clients or for your business, this might be something that eventually becomes important. And then one final thing that is really cool about n8n is that you can actually have multiple triggers or entry points into the automation. So I have a webhook here, but I could have two different webhooks that merge into the same module. So in Make, you are only allowed to create one scenario with one trigger in a given scenario, which in most cases is not a problem, but sometimes that'll require you to build more complex automations to do something that would be quite easy in n8n. Let's say we have an AI agent here in n8n, and we are communicating with that agent through Slack. It's pretty cool that we can communicate through Slack, but what if we wanted to communicate with this AI agent from Telegram as well? Well, in n8n, I can simply add another module. We'll go ahead and add Telegram. We'll trigger on a new message, put this right here. We can actually map that directly into the agent so that now we can actually chat with this agent through Slack or through Telegram. And then inside the agent here, we would simply update the text that we send it. So instead of only sending in the variables from Slack, we could say using the JavaScript. So we have this here, we could say use the Slack trigger, or if that is empty, let's go ahead and use Telegram instead. So I'm just going to copy this and then I'm going to come back to Telegram here and we could just change this to Telegram. So what this is saying is in JavaScript, it's saying, hey, if we have a message from Slack, let's use Slack. But if that's empty because the message came in through Telegram, let's use Telegram instead. So you can do cool stuff like that. You can actually have multiple triggers inside a n8n scenario and they can merge back together and then you can actually use both. If I was in Make here, I would not be able to add another trigger. If I added another module like a webhook, this module is here, but there's no way to use it. Notice that there is no lightning bolt like there is here. If I move it over here, then this automation here, this one's completely dead. Everything would come off of this one. In Make, you cannot have multiple triggers firing off at the same time. And then again, in Make as well, you can actually merge things together. So you can have two modules that merge into one. So in Make, you can't do that. So if we did have a scenario where we had some flow control where we branched off and the automation went down this way and then maybe it goes down this way, there is no way where this could then connect back up to a module like that. This is an invalid operation. This just cannot be done in Make, which typically doesn't present a problem if you know how to get around it, although sometimes it does, and you find yourself kind of hacking together something to work. But in n8n, you can always merge two different modules into one in a similar way that we did here. And you can see why that's powerful, because if I couldn't do that, if I couldn't also have a Telegram module here, along with my Slack trigger, then I would essentially have to figure out some other way or rebuild this automation twice, or have two different triggers that were in different scenarios that mapped together here, and then there was just one input here. It would just make it a lot more difficult to do something which is relatively common. So the ability to merge here is a really powerful feature. Now let's talk about AI adoption and the different features in both platforms. So both platforms are moving as quickly as they can to add more AI features. In Make, you can tell it to build automations and it will try to build out these different nodes for you, which is cool. But in general, I find I usually like to build these out manually anyway. So both companies are adopting AI. I talked to the VP of product at make.com and they explained all the very cool AI stuff that they have coming soon. But I would say that right now, n8n is moving quite a bit faster. And one of the best features that they have is this AI agent, which is able to communicate with some sort of chat. It's able to respond to a chat. You can give it different tools so that it's able to perform different actions like looking up records from Airtable or producing a AI video through HeyGen. You can book calendar events or send emails. You can connect up a memory so that it can remember all of the chats you're having here. You can hook it up to a vector database, and they also have vector database tools which take care of a lot of the work that you would have to do manually in make.com. They just have a few more of these AI related tools that are more deeply integrated with their platform than Make does. If I were to look at Make at this one particular module that is very easy to add, anytime you need a new agent, you simply come and you type agent and you drop it in. You got another agent here just like that. Now, to do the equivalent of this in Make, you would need to build something similar to this. So in make.com, here is a Slack agent that I had built out before I had used n8n. And you can see here, there's quite a few different modules here that I had to put together to listen to messages from Slack. And then depending on what that message was, go down this path or go down this path, and let's do this and do that. There's a lot of logic I had to specifically design, and it's actually quite rigid as well, right? Like it has to flow this particular way. And this automation in itself took me quite a bit of time to build, and it's completely replaced with this one module here. And not only is it completely replaced, but this is a whole lot more flexible. Instead of having to define all of these different actions and paths very specifically and therefore rigidly in an n8n agent, I can describe all of that logic in a prompt. I can describe all the tools and what it's supposed to do and how it's supposed to collect information from the user, all of which this automation was attempting to do. But what this agent is going to do is, through this conversation, and using the prompt, it's going to figure things out automatically and send that information or that request to a specific tool. If it needs information to get this tool working, it's actually going to send a message back to Slack or to Telegram where the user could then respond. It's going to come back in, and then it's going to send that message back in here. It can actually combine multiple tools. It can get content before it uses that content to maybe create an AI video. This is able to orchestrate a process on its own. Whereas in make.com right now, I have to build out that automation all on my own, and it's not even as flexible. I had to come up with every single possibility, whereas this agent is going to investigate and chat and pull things together and think on its own to facilitate the system prompt that we described here. So I would say in general, it looks like n8n is moving a bit faster when it comes to adopting AI and new features, although make.com is right behind. So now let's talk a little bit about why all of this matters to you. Building out all of these automations, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of investment, either in you learning or hiring somebody. Choosing the right platform is going to make a big difference in terms of your long-term success with automation. Automations are really only going to provide value if you can turn it on and it runs for 6 months or more without any issues, right? If you have to keep coming back to this and fixing it because it broke, or you had to move it somewhere else because you decided to change platforms, let's say you started on Make and then you moved to n8n, if you can't just build your automations and let them run for an extended period of time, then you're not really gaining anything. The whole point of an automation is to set it up and have it actually do work on your behalf consistently for a long period of time. Because if it takes you $10,000 to develop an automation, and then maybe you then move it to n8n because for some reason Make just didn't work and now you had to move it to n8n, and then you spend another $10,000 over on n8n, and let's just say that this automation only saves you $2,000 a year, well, you can kind of see that this just wasn't a good investment. Not only did we build it in the wrong spot, but then we had to rebuild it again. And now it's $20,000, but it's only actually saving us $2,000. So these decisions have a real consequence on the bottom line. And since automations are only there to help you save and scale, it's important to get this right. In an ideal situation, you actually spend $2,000 and the automation helps you save $10,000 every year. That's really what you want. All right, so given this, what is the most important thing to know when considering which automation platform you should use going forward? So now if we map this out, Make versus n8n, I think in general, what you're going to find is that both platforms can get the job done. In general, if you're building something, both of these platforms are going to be able to build it without much issue. One might be a little bit easier than the other, but both are going to accomplish essentially the same thing. Now, because Make is a lot easier to adopt, if you are new to automations or you're a business owner, you don't want to develop your own technical team where you have to hire really advanced people to manage your Make. Maybe you even want to pick an existing employee that you have that is pretty technical and you want to give them the ability to learn and build out automations for your company, but you don't really want to become a tech company. Then I think Make is going to be a better choice because it's a lot easier to find people that can modify it, or someone on your team without a technical background may be able to get in there, learn, build automations, and actually debug when there's issues. But if long-term, your plan is to go deep on AI automation, you're going to hire people that can help you do these things. You know you're going to be running a ton of automations and you want to potentially save money by using the self-hosted version, which has the potential to save you a ton of money. There's essentially no limits to how many automations you can run here. So you can see if you're automating large volumes of operations, this self-hosted option is going to be incredibly powerful and cost-effective. Long-term, as you learn, n8n is going to give you much greater flexibility in terms of your automations and how you build them out, giving you access to JavaScript, code, all great things if you have the technical team to back it up. So if you're looking for a powerful automation platform, but you want to keep it less technical, either as an automator or as a business owner, so that a typical employee could learn and build out automations, then I would go with Make. If you have long-term strategic plans to get into AI automation and to hire a team specifically that can do that, then go for the gold and go ahead and jump into n8n. You're going to have a lot more flexibility long term. Now, if you're trying to build an AI automation business, or you're a business owner trying to streamline your business operations, check out the No Code Architects community. It's an active community. We have weekly workshops. You can get tech support, and we have calls almost every single day where you can get help directly from me. And in the classroom, we have a Make and Airtable workshop. And in the Automation Vault, you can get access to all of my Make and n8n automations. As well, we have a business clarity course to help you launch your AI business. But above all, it's a great group of people working together to achieve our goals. Hope to see you in the community, but either way, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you on the next one.